Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague from Surrey for bringing her experience to this House. I think the best part of this new Parliament, from the viewpoint of the opposition, is not the fact that we're in opposition, Mr. Speaker. That's certainly not a bright point at all. But the bright point is the fact that 1/3 of our caucus is now made up of new members of Parliament. And the honourable member who just spoke brings to this House her experience as a municipal leader, and particularly in Surrey, with, as she mentioned, the largest RCMP detachment in the country, and in recent years, probably the most tasked detachment in the country, working with some of the challenges in violence and organized crime that area saw. And her leadership as mayor was recognized long before she joined this Parliament, Mr. Speaker. So that's when the House of Commons is at its best, when we have members of this place rising in the House to talk on legislation, not just based on what's contained in it, but how it impacts the lives of those impacted by the bill, how the work done by the men and women of the RCMP in Surrey and indeed across the country is fundamental to the safety and security of the people of Canada and the people of Surrey, which reached out to her council while she led council there with concerns about crime and these sorts of things. As a mayor, she also brought to the debate the impact of uniformed service on men and women in the RCMP, the rise of operational stress injuries, the risks to violence, the impact on family of stress, of moves, these sorts of things. So I appreciate her addition to the debate here today and her discussions with me and other members of our caucus on Bill C-7. And it's her input and the input of members across the country of the RCMP that is leading the official opposition to oppose C-7. As you may recall, Mr. Speaker, at the introduction of this bill, I said that we would try and work with the government on it. C-7 is in this place as a result of the Mounted Police Association of Ontario versus Canada Supreme Court decision, which clearly stated that the staff relations program at the RCMP was not sufficient to meet the rights of association guaranteed to all Canadians under the Charter. That program was an internal HR function that tried to work between management and the men and women on the front lines of the RCMP, but that Supreme Court decision that stated clearly that the exclusion of the RCMP from the Public Sector Labour Relations Act and their inability to associate violated the Charter, and therefore C-7 is here before us. And in my speech, I said that we would work with the government as a result of the timeline the Supreme Court of Canada gave Parliament to provide a framework so that men and women of the RCMP can get union representation in a way that suits the needs of the unique role the RCMP plays. And I remind members of this House, and I remind the government, that they were given a lot of flexibility by the court. The key element, though, was that the had to be free from management, so the type of collective structure needed that degree of independence from management, and that the rights and the freedoms of members needed to be reflected in that association. So their charter rights needed to be secured. And we didn't see that in C-7 from introduction through to committee, Mr. Speaker, and that's why our willingness to work with the government only had legs that got us to committee, Mr. Speaker. As my friend before me said, we were very concerned with sections 40 and 42 with C-7 that could have resulted in a patchwork of entitlements of RCMP members for health and occupational safety provisions across the country. In fact, sections 40 and 42 had nothing really to do with the standing up of a collective bargaining agent for the RCMP. It was essentially the outsourcing by the federal government of workers' compensation to provincial regimes, Mr. Speaker. And because each province is different, it would have taken a single unified national police force and created a patchwork of benefits for their members, depending on where Canada asked them to serve. And we had real problems with that, Mr. Speaker, because similar to my time in the Canadian Armed Forces, men and women in the RCMP uniform go where their nation needs them, whether it's to Surrey or whether it's to Shelburne, Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. And they should not have to worry about a patchwork of benefits and occupational rights depending on which posting they were in, Mr. Speaker. So I am happy to say that the government did listen to the concerns the official opposition expressed with respect to 40 and 42. Ultimately, some of their own members, I'm sure, heard from members of the RCMP, and they agreed to strike those provisions at committee. And I applaud the government for that, for listening. I also have to remind you, Mr. Speaker, that I had profound concerns that some members of the RCMP felt that they were being told that they could not speak to their Member of Parliament and express concerns that they had as Canadians about a bill impacting them and their family, C-7. So, once again, the government disappointed the opposition and myself as critic. I rose in this House to seek unanimous consent of this House to show that a matter before us that impacts thousands of Canadians across the country, none of them should be intimidated or prevented from giving their opinion to their Member of Parliament. And because there was that concern within the RCMP, I stood in this House and asked for unanimous consent to say, as parliamentarians, we should hear from all members impacted by the legislation that we're debating and voting on. And sadly, members of the government denied unanimous consent for such a basic, fundamental democratic right, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't asking for the ability of uniformed RCMP members to throw up bonfires and protests. We were asking for the simple democratic right for a member of the RCMP or their partner or spouse to come to their MP and express their concerns on legislation. I was profoundly disappointed when the government denied that unanimous consent that would have encouraged MPs to hear from people in uniform on probably the most profound bill, Mr. Speaker, impacting the RCMP in generations. While we're on the topic of democratic rights, Mr. Speaker, the other thing I said clearly in my initial speech on C-7 was the fact that we expected C-7 and ultimately the collective bargaining unit for the RCMP to be the subject of a vote by members. And we said that in the House, we said that at committee, and the government is not providing that, Mr. Speaker. In fact, when you combine C-7 and C-4, they're taking away that right from members of the RCMP in one bill and being silent on it in C-7, knowing full well that they're going to pass C-4, depriving members of a secret ballot vote while concurrently passing C-7. Mr. Speaker, I think that's shameful, and that's why we're opposing C-7. And why is it shameful, Mr. Speaker? We are debating C-7 as the result of a Supreme Court of Canada decision that asked Parliament to fill the void that the Supreme Court indicated was there with the exclusion of the RCMP from the Public Sector Labour Relations Act. So we're here debating C-7 because of a court decision. But no members of the RCMP have really been asked about this fundamental question. And why would the government fear giving a secret ballot vote to all members, from Surrey to Shelburne, to vote on a collective bargaining agent that's in their own interests, Mr. Speaker? What's ironic is every member of the 338 before this chamber were elected to this place by secret ballot vote. But they don't feel the same people that we give the important task of keeping Canadians safe in rural parts of Canada where the RCMP is the only face of the government and of law and order in this country. We're not giving those members we asked to keep us safe the basic, fundamental democratic right to vote on representation for them collectively, Mr. Speaker. It's a sad irony that this new government that runs on and talks about sunny ways is clouding those sunny ways by running C-4 and C-7 through the House at the same time. So, Mr. Speaker, while I'm glad that they listened to us and struck 40 and 42 from this bill, the fact that they're not listening to the existing concerns my colleague from Surrey mentioned, they're not giving the men and women the right to vote, means that Canada's official opposition, the Conservative Party, cannot support Bill C-7. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And we need to recognize that, again, one of the reasons why we have this legislation before us today is because of a Supreme Court of Canada ruling. But at the end of the day, it's also important for us to recognize the valuable contributions that unions and organized labour play in Canadian society. And this is something in which I think is very widespread in terms of that recognition. I can appreciate the Conservatives might have some concerns with respect to the management issue, with respect to the registering of unions and so forth. I believe at the end of the day, maybe the member can just reflect on how important it is that the RCMP be afforded this legislation, which then ultimately allows them to have that union representation. And it's that principle that I think is really important, and why it is I think that Conservatives might want to revisit the way in which they're voting. And I'm wondering if he can provide a comment on that issue of the principle of being able to have a bargaining unit to represent the RCMP.
The Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's interesting in my colleague's question is he said the RCMP are being afforded with this legislation that came as a result of the Supreme Court of Canada decision. I agree they have. Why should they not also be afforded the basic democratic right to then have their own vote on whether or not they have a collective bargaining agent and who that should be? We're setting the framework here. We're affording them the ability to have that as a result of the Supreme Court of Canada decision in Mounted Police Association of Ontario. But we're not then affording the rank and file to have their say. And, Mr. Speaker, in light with the fact that in recent weeks we're hearing that many of those rank and file do not understand the full impact of C-7 on their workplace, means that we should then give them the right to absorb the framework given by C-7. So if the honourable member feels we should afford the force this right to collectively organize, we should then afford the same right to the individual members that are the collective of what the union will represent.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend for his comments, although I'm a little bit surprised that the Conservatives have chosen this element of this piece of legislation to circle again and again and again as their main point of contention, rather than the piece that's excluded from this legislation and the imagined collective bargaining that would happen between the employees and the employer, this being the RCMP, that excludes the right of members to bargain around things like sexual harassment and workplace safety and security of the members as they serve our communities so diligently. It seems to me, given the unfortunate recent history and long history, unfortunately, of the RCMP, where we have these massive court cases now being conducted by women who served in the RCMP who went through sexual harassment on the workplace and was never rectified, despite commissioner after commissioner and government after government saying this was important. It never happened. They've had to take it to court. Why would the Liberals then choose to exclude that specifically from the right to bargain around issues like sexual harassment and workplace safety for those that are serving our communities? No other collective bargaining in the country would exclude this. For heaven's sakes, why would the Liberals want to do this for the members of the RCMP? It's just beyond me. And I'll leave with this, Mr. Speaker. This is one of the reasons why many women join unions, is so they can have sexual harassment enshrined in their collective rights to protect them, so that the employers cannot abuse those privileges that they have as an employer. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Durham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member from Skeena-Bulkley Valley for his intervention. I think what his question best illustrates is the fact that C-7 is not well understood. In fact, I said at committee, and I said quite clearly, as someone that served in uniform of the military for 12 years and understands the paramilitary structure of the RCMP, there needs to be the ability to have postings, appraisals, operational performance, those sorts of things. And so we tried to sort of understand the approach on exclusions, Mr. Speaker. But what he's illustrating and what members of the RCMP have told us is that they have concerns about some of them. I don't feel that some of the exclusions result in what some people are suggesting about harassment or workplace safety. Those have to be paramount considerations, and our previous government brought legislation to this place on the harassment issue itself. That's critical, Mr. Speaker. But what his question and what the emails and calls I get show is that members have not really been asked for their say with respect to C-7. The rushing, the limiting of debate, and then the elimination of that right to vote of frontline members has profound considerations, Mr. Speaker, and is why we will be opposing C-7.